everyone. This is Brooke Warner, and I'm here with Linda Joy Myers. Hi, Linda Joy.
Hi, Brooke, and welcome, everybody.
Welcome to what made the Liars Club a best-selling memoir. And we'd love to start out with a little bit of a sense of who we have on the webinar tonight. So if you could just put in hello and maybe where you're from. If we know who you are, feel free to just say, hey, Brooke, and hey, Linda Joy. And you can put your notes in the chat window or the questions window, but I think we're going to encourage you all to be in the questions window. And yeah, we love to just know where you're from and say hi, so thank you. People coming in from Duluth and Florida and Augusta, Georgia, wonderful people we know, people from previous classes. Hi, everyone. Awesome. Okay. And
Great.
Jody from New Zealand, so we got the people from abroad too, which I love. All right.
It speaks to the popularity of this book, and that's really what we're excited about sharing in terms of what we learned from it. So glad you're all here.
Yeah, absolutely. And that also want to just mention that this book was chosen by popular demand. We actually did put out a poll on this one to ask people what was the next book that they would like to see us teach, because this is part of our ongoing longer series of best-selling memoirs. And Mary Karr, against a handful of other books, Augustin Burroughs and some others, won by a landslide. So it is a popular book, and it just has impacted people for many, many years. And so we're excited to talk about it tonight. And before we dive in, for those of you who don't know us or might be new to our webinars, we're going to introduce ourselves briefly.
I'm Linda Joy Myers. I'm the president of the National Association of Memoir Writers, and my memoir is called Don't Call Me Mother, A Daughter's Journey from Abandonment to Forgiveness. And I'm also the author of 2 books on memoir writing, The Power of Memoir and Journey of Memoir.
And I'm Brooke Warner. I'm the publisher of She Writes Press. I have a coaching practice called Warner Coaching, where I support authors to get published. And I have 2 books, What's Your Book and How to Sell Your Memoir. And then Linda Joy and I have a new book out. Some of you know about it, called Breaking Ground on Your Memoir, and we'd love for you to check it out if you're interested in memoir, and particularly the craft of memoir. It's been out about a month and a half or 2 months, so it's making its way out into the world and looking good. All right, so we're going to just dive right in here and talk about Mary Karr and the Liars Club, and Linda Joy is going to kick it off for us.
Yeah, so one of the themes of this book, or a major theme in this book, is trauma of various kinds. And Brooke and I see so many people writing about trauma in our classes that we teach. So we wanted to kind of wind back and look at Mary Karr's book, The Liars Club, as one of the earliest books that dealt with the issue of trauma. And there's so much to learn by reading it. So very striking, Mary Karr is a poet and was a poet before she wrote The Liars Club. And so you see the use of poetic language and vivid description as a way of her handling this issue of trauma and how to write about it. And she starts on the very first page using colors, her talking about the yellow shirt and a nightgown with blue bonnets on it. And she goes and she takes us into her world using vivid details, which is something we teach all of our students to do, because this is what brings the reader in, and we find this world here that we start to inhabit. She uses, and these are just normal writing skills that she's using, but she's using them really, really well. There are some very strong traumatic events. There's different layers of traumatic events. There's traumatic events having to do with her mother and kind of having a psychotic episode that is woven through the book. There are a couple of major sexual abuse scenes. And it's very interesting to see how she wrote about them. And this was written before there were many hundreds or more of books written about this kind of trauma, about sexual abuse. And I think that's why it made such an impact on the world, is that here's somebody who's actually saying what happened. So the way she handles the traumatic scenes, all different ones, is she uses this description, but she also is very factual. She slows things down. It almost seemed like the trauma scenes were in slow motion at times. And she also has this voice and this tone. She's a bit of a smart aleck, and you'll see it from the very first page. She's got this great Southern humor, and she writes with a lot of irony, you know, tongue-in-cheek, cynical. And then there are times when she strips that completely away, and she's a vulnerable child. And so the way that she does this is that the now narrator is the cynical one, although I think she had some cynical roots even as a child. She was looking through the eyes of someone who's seen too much at a very young age. But she uses what we call the now narrator to guide the reader through many, many scenes, and particularly the traumatic scenes. So if you read it again or reread it, notice when she's a grown-up commenting on what she's telling you about, and when she's collapsed into being the character, being the little girl in the scenes that she's recounting. And it seems to me that she is writing trauma so it's bearable to read, although that's a subjective, that's obviously a subjective judgment. Sometimes it's not bearable for anyone to read any of this, and yet so many people are trying to write about their experiences honestly and truthfully, and we do a lot of programs on that, National Association of Memoir Writers, and it's very, very challenging. So I think we can use Mary Karr as an example of how she did it and help you think about how you can do it.
Yeah, it's a really good point, because it struck me so much. I agree with you about the abuse scenes, that they were at times so detailed, and we're going to be teaching a 4-week course on this book. As we do, we always give these entrees to give you guys a taste, and then people can join us for more if they want. And that writing about the trauma is so important, because we have so many people in our classes who don't quite know how to handle trauma. Some people really treat it, I think, too lightly, so much so that they glaze over it and don't make enough of it. And then other people almost go too intensely. So there is a fine balance. And Mary Karr, I think, does go in there pretty intensely, but at least she shows you how far you can go. So I'm going to be talking about this varied narrative and what does this mean, her voice techniques to guide the reader through a complicated story and through to transformation. So when this book was chosen for us, granted it was among the contenders, but it's because every time we have talked about it, people have said to us, oh my gosh, I love that book changed my life, I see now why. And I believe that what Linda Joy said is true, that this is a book that transformed a lot of people's life because it gave people permission to speak out, because it is one of these early books that named the abuse, that named what happened, that spoke about it with such truth. And yet it's also a very, very complicated narrative. She tells a complicated story, and I'm going to be talking about the structure a little bit later in tonight's course. But I wanted to speak to some of the things that she does that are maybe unusual, but also very interesting, and things that you guys can emulate and do in your own writing. Because what she does at various points, she talks to the reader, she has parenthetical asides, she talks about memory, she talks about not remembering. She weaves scenes in which she basically is saying the details are very fuzzy. I don't exactly remember what happened here. It's interesting because in our classes, a lot of times we're saying, look, give yourself creative license. You can create composite characters. We don't want you to fictionalize anything, of course, because that would not make it memoir, but certainly you can take creative license to recreate scenes and to tell them as if what would have happened to the best of your memory, and we're constantly talking about the emotional truth. Well, Mary Karr shows you ways to talk about things that you might remember in a very fuzzy way using interesting kinds of techniques. And so she often departs from the narrative and brings in what we would call the now narrator. And so even in the very beginning of the book, when she's setting up the book, she'll say things like, I don't remember talking. I must have eventually told Dr. Boudreau there weren't any marks on me. So these kinds of I must have, I don't remember, she says there must have been an ambulance outside. So she's projecting out the things that must have happened because that's what would have happened on a night like this. The book starts from this early traumatic memory that she has. And she's intentionally vague about it. And I think it's fascinating on page 9 of the book. And for those of you who don't have it, I'm trying to give enough context so that you can understand what's happening. But basically, it's a traumatic event that happens in the very beginning of the book that she essentially says to us, like, this is my early horrible memory. And she weaves it in a way that is intentionally fuzzy. And she writes, I don't remember who we got farmed out to or for how long. Some memory endures. And then she actually writes in here, which I find fascinating actually, just in terms of a voice or a narrative technique. Again, this is on page 9. It says, because it took so long for me to paste together what happened, I will leave that part of the story missing for a while. It went long, unformed for me, and I want to keep it that way here. I don't mean to be coy. When the truth would be unbearable, the mind often just blanks it out. It's really powerful, and it's a departure from what you will normally see in narrative for memoir. She does speak to the reader sometimes, not a lot, but she does use second person. And there is this obvious narrative voice who comes in, who sort of is on top of the story, and who often is pulling out interesting little tidbits and asides in parenthetical asides, literally kind of separating herself out from the narrative itself and pulling you forward to say things like, you know, oh, now my sister is a banker, and my sister was really good at cross country at the time. I personally found these things difficult to deal with at times. I didn't mind the parenthetical asides, but I thought that she used them a lot. And I think other people probably really love them, and it depends on the reader, and it depends on what you like. In terms of speaking directly to the reader, this is something I think is effective. On page 71, for instance, she's talking about her mother and the threats that her mother used to make, and she said that her mother's threats worked way better than any spanking could have. Your mother's threat of homicide, however unlikely she tries to make it sound, will flat dampen your spirits. And that is also a foreshadowing, because later there is a scene in which the mother threatens murder, threatens to murder the kids. And it is part of what I'm going to talk about when I talk about the circular structure later in the story that happens. But the takeaway for today, for this particular section for you guys, is the freedom that you have. And Linda Joy and I are always teaching this in our longer classes. I think a lot of people get very stuck in, like, oh, I'm in high school English and I have to write a certain way and it needs to be, you know, just right. It doesn't. You have a lot of freedom to write the story that you want to tell in the way that you want to tell it. And reading people like Mary Karr can show you just how much playfulness, and yes, it's structured, and yes, it's very well thought out, but there's also a lot of movement and a lot of different kinds of crafts that she's employing all the time that make for a kind of upbeat and at times surprising read. So it's exciting. She keeps you on your toes.
And when we go through the details of this in the forward class, I'm really excited about that, because we're going to dig down into exactly what she does and what we think can really work. And then there's some things that she does that we're like, well, that's an advanced level of choice on some of these techniques. So it's just so interesting to. I reread this book several times, and I have to say that every time I learned something new and saw something new, so it was exciting. Now, characterization. Oh gosh, this is such a big thing in her memoir. So she characterizes everything, and by that I mean she brings a sense of the flavor of the place that they live, the land, herself, her family. It's incredible, and I do have a couple of examples. I'm going to do little slices of examples because they're fun to hear about. So on page 34, there's this one sentence. There's a couple sentences that briefly characterize the town she calls Leachfield, which is a made-up name, but it's a real place that she grew up in. In case you think I exaggerate Leachfield's overall nastiness, Business Week once voted it one of the 10 ugliest towns on the planet, which I thought was great.
Not holding back.
I know. And then she says, there were the white oil storage tanks, miles of them, like the abandoned eggs of a terrible prehistoric insect. And there's her poetry coming through, and she uses this simile. But you can just see, the white storage tanks. We know what they look like, but then thinking of them as abandoned eggs of a prehistoric insect is another whole angle on the whole thing. So that's one, just that one. And then I love the one she does about what it's like in Texas. I grew up in Oklahoma, so I really relate to this. So here's how she describes the landscape, a few lines. Out in West Texas, the sky is bigger than other places. There are no hills or trees. The only building is an occasional filling station, and these are scarce. How the westward settlers decided to keep moving in the face of all that, nothing. I can't imagine. The scenery is blank and the sky total. So she starts to talk about a storm, and anybody who's ever been through a Midwestern storm is going to relate to that right there. But it's actually a really big storm, and it's an important storm. It's not just put in there for fun. Her plotting is also very precise, although you can't tell that when you first read it because it's written so parenthetically and within what we call an associative style. There's just a lot of flow to it. So now she also weaves characterizations of her mother, father, grandmother, her sister, but she weaves them in an interesting way. She does them traditionally through description by describing what people are doing or what they look like. But on page 23, she has this phrase: if Daddy's past was more intricate to me than my own present, Mother's was as blank as the West Texas desert she came from. She was born into the Dust Bowl, a vast flat landscape peppered with windmills and occasional cotton ranches. That tells both where she's from and a bit of what she is like. The grandmother that lives with them has a brain tumor and brings her own brand of chaos into the home, and you see her characterized all the way through until she dies. And it doesn't take long. Within 40 pages, 30 to 40 pages, you're like, how did this person survive all this? I mean, we don't quite know. So, but what she does is that she takes these moments of when something significant happens, and she weaves them together to create the arc of the story. So what we like to look at when people are writing is to encourage people to use dialogue, to make sure and use action, and not just telling us something, but painting a picture, using dialogue to show how people talk. For instance, on page 15, I just want to mention that the theme for the title, I love to read books and figure out, now, where did the title come from? And sometimes you have to read a whole book before you really figure it out, and sometimes you know immediately. But on page 15, she says, she's characterizing her father. Of all the men in the Liars Club, Daddy told the best stories. When he started one, the guys invariably fell quiet, studying their laps or their cards or the inner rims of their beer mugs like men in prayer. I just love that. And then, oops, she talks about what his face looks like. His tough half-breed face would move between solemn blankness and caricature. He kept stock expressions for stock characters, and so on. He goes on. There's a lot about the father. The mother is introduced at the beginning in a very frightening scene. So, but the now narrator comes in and describes the mother as being very nervous, that the little girl understands the context of this chaotic scene. So, context and weaving and painting, these are other art form words, but they all come together to create this unusual picture.
Yeah, it's fascinating to think about the importance of characterization, actually. And when we taught Angela's Ashes, it struck me so much how much characterization there was of so many different characters. And each time we teach one of these books, I feel like my mind is opened a bit to, wow, that person does this so brilliantly. But Mary Karr is one who does characterization so well. And what you realize is that you start to care about the characters on a whole other level when people do a lot of characterization. And care is an interesting word when I use it, because it's not like you necessarily have to like them, because in a lot of these books, especially these coming of age books, the characters are pretty messed up. They have a lot of stuff going on, but you're curious about them, and they have a lot of complex dynamics, and that certainly is the case with Mary Karr's parents, and it just descends downward into, you know, such horrible places as the book progresses.
Yeah.
All right, so I'm going to be talking about her circular structure. I love to look at books for their structures and to see what they have going on. This kind of structure is unlike anything I've ever seen, honestly, and probably not the best structure to emulate if you're a new memoirist. The reason that we're calling it circular is because of the way that it kind of turns in and around and upside down on itself, and the way that she pulls her memories is relatively, I would say, fluid, in that she will be any given place in the narrative, and even though she's moving along a timeline, she's referring back to things that she's already talked about and circling back around to ideas. Normally, in other kinds of memoirs, we might call something like that the pulling through of through threads. If you guys have been in our classes before, you know that we teach about this idea of a through thread, something that weaves through the manuscript. So in this book, for instance, the Liars Club, the idea of the Liars Club and who these guys are, her dad and his cronies who hang out and basically just shoot the shit all day. The Liars Club in and of themselves are a theme, and they are woven through the book, and they are a through thread, but that's different than a circular narrative structure, because what happens with the circular structure is that it's basically this idea that I'm talking about, that it weaves back around on itself, that she comes back around and she circles in a way with the narrative. And it's, like I said, it's a little bit complex to follow, but you will know what I'm talking about. I mean, the reason that I chose this image of this spiral kind of turned upside down and in on itself is because that's the impact that it has on you when you read the book. So I mentioned here in these bullet points, she directs the reader in explicit terms. Well, that's the stuff that I already shared with you guys, right? That right off the bat on page 9, she's saying, I'm not going to tell you what's going on. You know, that basically this is a part of the story that went missing for a while. It was unformed for me, and I want to keep it that way here. And so she tells you right away, you're going to have to wait for that. And so what's interesting is that the last bullet point I say here is that she's setting up a payoff early on. And she, of course, makes good on that. I mean, can you imagine setting up something like that and then not making good on what it was? No, right? So she needs to pay off that promise, and she does. But you have to wait a really long time to get there. So the point at which we learn about that night, right? She opens up the book talking about this night and the memory, and it's a very intricate scene about what happened that night, even though it's really shrouded in this fuzzy memory, which she writes about, I think, rather brilliantly. But on page 157, which is about midway through the book, is when we discover what actually happened that night, which is that her mother actually threatens to kill her and her sister. And the horrible thing about it is that she picks up the phone and she calls their doctor, Mary Karr supposes, and actually says, "I've just killed them both of them. I've stabbed them both to death." So it's a threat. She doesn't obviously end up killing her daughters, but she goes so far as to pick up the phone and tell someone that she's done it. Well, you can imagine how utterly terrifying that would be. So this is a real trauma. It's not the only trauma in the book, of course. The sexual abuse, I would argue, is another horrible trauma, and there are 2 explicit sexual abuse scenes. But this is the trauma that she sets out as the memory that launches the book. And then she, throughout, so the grandmother, the crazy grandmother, the horrible grandmother, also seeds something important for them in that on page 77, she discloses to Mary that she has these siblings, these half-siblings that her mother basically abandoned. So all along the way, she's seeding for you these really crazy family secrets, personal traumas, and you're gathering the information as you go, and so it has this feeling like you just keep picking things up and picking things up and picking things up. And you know, interestingly, of course, if you look at what the book is, its part 1 is called Texas 1961, part 2 is called Colorado 1963. So she's writing it as if it's linear, but it's really not linear. Because of this complicated way that she tells the story. And then she goes back to Texas again in 1980, and she opens this part by saying, 17 years later, Daddy had a stroke while sitting on a stool, bellied up to the American Legion bar. This reminds me actually quite a bit of The Glass Castle, when Jeanette Walls in that book is very much coming of age. She's a child moving into adolescence, and then she jumps way forward to adulthood, and then we get this small little section at the end of the book that is about her adulthood, and Mary Karr does the same thing. So maybe Jeanette Walls got her idea to do that by reading Mary Karr. As we're always saying, it's totally okay to lift other people's structures. Don't feel like you can't. And so then it is the end of the book where she finally makes good on things. You know, her parents are both not in good shape, and she has to call her therapist on page 311 to rehearse the questions that she's going to ask her mother. This is the very end of the book. Who were the 2 kids Grandma Moore showed me pictures of? After she died, why did you go nuts? What were you doing with the knife that night? Why did you tell Dr. Boudreau you'd killed us? What happened to you in the hospital? These are poignant questions. My God, can you imagine someone sitting on their deathbed and you're going to ask all of these questions?
Speaking of cleaning up an end-of-life mess.
Yeah, right. And she just has so many of them, and they're all so intense. And you can imagine you can feel the pressure. That's another thing that I want to say about this, so that we have been built up in such a way to want to know the answers to these questions ourselves. So we, the reader, have something at stake as she's asking these questions. And she does disclose. I mean, the mother then does talk about some of her feelings, and it's sad. And the tragic part is Mary Karr's response. I actually love this, and it's devastating at the same time, but she says, as to why she hadn't told us all of this before about the marriages and the lost children, her exact sentence stays lodged in my head, for it's one of the more pathetic sentences a 60-year-old woman can be caught uttering. I thought you wouldn't like me anymore.
Oh, wow.
And it is. It's pitiful. And essentially at the end, Mary absolves herself from all of these things that she's been carrying. She takes the last 2 pages to say, you know, these crimes that I've been led to believe were, you know, that I was guilty of are not mine. They were cobbled together out of fear. It's very punchy. I would argue in some ways it's I don't want to use the word contrived, but it's the first one that's coming to mind because it's so tightly wrapped up, but it's also very strongly about transformation. So the end of the book, the end of any of your books, memoir needs to have transformation. We need to see someone get to resolution. She chooses to get to a lot of resolution in a very short time at the very end of her book, and that is okay. It's certainly one way to do it. It's powerful. It works. Not everyone has a story that can be quite so tightly summed up. Not everyone is going to be sitting with their mother at the end of their life with these huge questions to ask and then be able to say, well, I absolved myself of all of that.
Yeah.
You know, it doesn't work that way for everyone, and it's okay to leave open-ended questions in your memoirs. But this is how the Liars Club ends, and I think it's powerful. So one thing I also just wanted to share before I end this section is that I think she has some really amazing ways in which she writes about memory. And it's a pretty powerful thing to look at in the sense that she is super, super skilled at writing about things like they're fuzzy or like she doesn't quite remember them or that they are like fragments of memory. And one of the ones that I just wanted to share with you guys because I think it's very powerful and hopefully can help you guys in your own writing, when she writes about her mom standing on the steps with the knife, a 12-inch shine of a butcher knife, and she's basically there threatening to kill her children. This is amazing. She says, "No sooner do I choke down that scream than a miracle happens. A very large pool of quiet in my head starts to spread. Lisa's face shrinks back like somebody in the wrong end of your telescope. Then even Mother's figure starts to alter and fade. In fact, the thin, spidery female form in black stretch pants and turtleneck wielding a knife in one upraised arm is only a stick figure of my mother, like the picture I drew in magic marker on the Mother's Day card I gave her last Sunday." And I want to encourage you guys to go back and read that passage again. It's on page 155 and 156, because what she does here is absolutely amazing, really, if you think about it. What she's done is talk about showing, when we talk about showing versus telling, she has shown you what it feels like, in essence, to black out or to have something recede and to kind of leave your body. She is showing a dissociative experience. And I can't imagine, you know, the skill that it took or maybe how long she spent writing this paragraph, but it's beautifully, she could have just said, I blacked out, you know, or I left my body because it was too hard to witness, but she didn't. She showed exactly what that experience was like to fade out of her own body, and it's just a fabulous example of showing.
This is something that we do teach a lot because people want, you know, we've gotten used to psychospeak in the world, you know, like, well, I had depression, or, you know, I dissociated. But really, we don't know what your actual experience was. Everybody's dissociation is different. Everybody's depression is different. What do you mean by that? So we encourage people not to use clinical terms at all. And I'm always teaching, I say, tell us what that is like and do not use any of those words, those buzzwords.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so Mary Karr does it right. I mean, we see what she sees.
Yeah, I love it. I just thought that was brilliant. There's lots of moments like that that are powerful. So this takes us to the end of, oh no, we have the end. We're just going to say, why did Liars Club strike a resonant chord? And then we're going to move into Q&A and also an invitation to come to the longer course. So your couple points, Linda Joy, why do you think this book was so resonant?
Well, it blew everything open, I think. This book and Angela's Ashes were, and This Boy's Life, were the early memoirs. This Boy's Life came out even earlier, but Mary Karr's book was the first one to really take on abuse, crazy family. Now it's like, okay, another dysfunctional family book. Well, no, they're all different. Just like every happy family is different. Every unhappy family is different. And she did this by exploring all these things with her poetic imagery and her voice. And it's her voice and her imagery that make it bearable. And her carefulness in writing. She's very careful, as Brooke has been pointing out. She is doing, we can feel her skill and her craft here. And the other thing is that she's all the way out there. I mean, I don't know, I'm sure there's things she didn't tell, but if you've read all 3 of her books, there's a lot of revealing going on. And that's one thing that we also teach. You know, it's writing a memoir is like walking around without your clothes on. We know this, how that feels. It's hard, it's challenging. But Mary Karr says, okay, this is it. She peels everything back. She peels layers of history. She gets into the insides of these people who were not always likable. In fact, they're a little disgusting, some of them. And in her later books, she does the same thing. It's amazing.
And my points were this dysfunctional family told in a dispassionate narrative, which if any of you joined us for the Glass Castle course, we did a whole session about dispassion and how to write from a dispassionate place. I mean, these horrible things happen, but she's not a pitiful character. She's not someone to be pitied. And that's very clear. And I think it's really the only way to write about trauma. And then the use of humor, offsetting how horrid it all is by humor, which of course Frank McCourt did in Angela's Ashes. I mean, I think anybody who's writing these kinds of difficult coming of age stories has to do that a little bit. And it's not easy to do, but it is important. And she's so feisty. So you kind of are like alternately bewitched by her and annoyed by her. I found myself at a couple points feeling like, come on, Mary. And so and that's okay. I mean, that's another thing that I think is really powerful is like, I read this and I thought, you know what, she's not always likable. And that's great in a certain sense, because you want a character who is you need to be flawed. If you're perfect and everything is great, the reader doesn't really want to hang with you. You're just like, wow, well, you never do anything wrong. That's fine. So that level of self-awareness and bringing that into the dialogue. But I completely agree with Linda Joy about the, I mean, I said this earlier about the trauma and how important this sharing was. And I think that it was a springboard for so much of the memoir that we see today, and opening up the floodgates for people telling their personal story. And it's given a lot of hope and permission, and just outing of this is my experience and I'm okay. Affected, yes, but okay. So it's good stuff. Okay, so we offer these courses. We love for anyone, anytime, of course, to take our free courses, and we're going to keep offering them. We want you guys to also suggest to us books that you wish that we would teach, because we listen. We're very much interested in having you guys let us know what books you want to hear about. I think that these experiences of doing these courses really can blow open the possibility for your own writing. So we want you to check out Write Your Memoir in 6 months. Lots of you are already signed up and have done classes with us, and that's fantastic. We have lots of alumni on the call, so thank you for being here. And we are doing what we normally do on these calls, which is offering this 4-week course on Mary Karr for $75, and that is just going to last through tonight. There's an easy link from the home page, Write Your Book in 6 months. If you go onto the home page, you'll see it there right in the center, because that long link is really going to be too hard to cut and paste or try to type into your browsers. But this class starts a week from tonight, same time, and it's going to last for a week. So we always record, so if you have to miss it, you get the audio, you get the video. You can keep that as long as you want. You can listen to it. If Mary Karr is someone who's moved you or whose writing you admire, if you want to figure out some of the techniques that she does to make your own memoir writing more strong, I think this is the point of these classes, you know, that you can learn to be a better writer by doing this stuff. And
yeah,
then...
Oh, sorry, but I just want to add, it's so inspiring, I think, too, to try to stand in her shoes in a way and look objectively at how did she, you know, it's sort of getting behind the screen, in the Emerald City, you know, how is this being done? And to me, it's still fascinating to think about.
Yeah, I completely agree. And and then we always do this too. We offer you guys discounts for the 6-month course, which is starting this spring. So if you're interested in checking out the 6-month course, please do. It's an intensive. It has just gotten stronger and stronger. The people who are in our 6-month courses are doing a lot of great work, and you can check all this out on the website. We want to move into Q&A and give you guys an opportunity to ask your questions about Mary Karr. There's lots of rich questions already being posed, and so that's fantastic. And the final thing we just wanted to seed for you guys tonight is that we're doing an in-person October conference. So for people who want to come to Berkeley or who live nearby, we're doing an in-person conference in October of this year, and we're super looking forward to that. So.
Magic of Memoir. Magic of Memoir 2015 is the website, and it's October 17th and 18th. So check it out on the website.
Perfect. All right, so I'm going to leave this slide up here for people who want to go on and check out any of these links. And then in the meantime, we're ready to take your questions. And so they're coming in. And please pose any questions you might have about Mary Karr or Memoir in general. And the first one, Linda Joy, is from Valerie. It says, what do you think the emotional heart of this memoir is, and why was it such a mesmerizing read from a psychological point of view?
On my therapeutic background, I see. Well, I think there's two parts. One is that she had the courage to tell the truth about a lot of very shameful things, and she confesses how ashamed she feels that the abuser, the particular abuser in the second molest scene, chose her. What did she do wrong? And this is a universal, that's one aspect of it. The other is that for those of us who grew up in dysfunctional homes of various sorts, you're not supposed to talk about this. You're not supposed to let people know how horrible it was. And there's some extremely disgusting scenes in here. I mean, I just feel like throwing up sometimes when I'm reading it, going, oh my God, you know. And yet there it is. And so I think that it appeals to, you know, the need we have to write a healing story, to tell our truth no matter what. And it's still hard to do no matter how many times I and some of the students I've given permission to do that. It's a challenge. And so I think she inspired people to, you know, to not be so ashamed of themselves.
I totally agree with that. And a lot of the people who I know who just think that this book was a game changer, totally changed their lives, had some sort of abuse history and just felt like, oh my God, this is so courageous and so really standing up for people everywhere who've had these kinds of experiences, and that's powerful. So another question here from Valerie. I've been told you can't write about domestic abuse if the ex is still living, but can be written if the abuse has been seen by others, and that this has to do with privacy and legal issues. Well, here's the deal.
Yeah.
You absolutely can write about someone who is still living, and it's your prerogative. The facts are the facts. But if you are worried that that person is going to sue, or if there's any potential libel, which means like you're smearing that person, then it could be grounds for a lawsuit. You have to be careful because people like this oftentimes will come after you. They might not have a leg to stand on in court, but you do have to tread carefully. You probably should get your work legally vetted. I've done a lot of books over the years where people have named names, and you know, the truth is that it's hard to prove in court that someone has done something libelous. That said, you know, you might not want your ex in your life. You know, they could be threatening. There's lots of things that could happen. So there are two sides of this, legal and personal.
But I'd like to add that you can write about it. It's getting it published that's the issue. And so sometimes you go, well, I can't write about it because they're already worried about the publication of it, and yet it's a story that won't leave them alone. So write about it, join a class, get it off your chest, put it all out there. and then see where you end up. A lot of times the way that what we want to publish is different than what we wanted to write and needed to write about in our first draft. And by then you may not have a legal issue. Who knows? You have to go through it first before you know what you have.
That's such good advice. Yeah, it's kind of putting the cart before the horse a little bit, and so let yourself write it, and then yeah, change. You talk about changing the details at a later point. So Rebecca's asking, what are the key components of a successful resolution? And a follow-up question: must every thread be tied up?
Well, since life isn't tied up.
Yeah, exactly.
Successful, it depends on how you define successful and resolution, but if we're looking at the resolution of the book or the storyline, so the storyline, most of us are still living out, well, not always, but many times we're still living out some of the storyline. A lot of times you can leave something very untied up, but perhaps with a suggestion or a hint or a poetic image. Sometimes if you don't let people know exactly what happened, it feels like you're avoiding something. So it depends on the material, it depends on the book, it depends on the themes. What do you think about that, Brooke?
Yeah, I agree with you completely, and I think sometimes, like I said, this was very tidy. I think that Mary Karr did kind of a big bang ending, and that can feel very tight. A lot of people like that. People want that kind of resolution sometimes, but I've been equally satisfied by things that have been very open-ended. I can think of lots of memoirs that have ended without much resolution per se. Things are still sort of up in the air, but that wasn't what the book was about. Like I read a lot of books that have to do with emotional states. I was talking to our class last night about the book called The Monkey Mind, which is about anxiety, or Carolyn Knapp's Drinking a Love Story, which is about her love affair with alcohol and the subsequent problems with that. It's not like Daniel Smith, who wrote Monkey Mind, wrote the book and is like, now I'm not anxious anymore. Or Carolyn Knapp wrote the book and is like, now I'm totally free from, any trouble with alcohol. No, and that's not what you're looking for, right? So to Linda Joy's point, I think it very much depends on what you're writing about. But you do want to offer your readers some sort of takeaway and some sort of the end should show transformation. What did you learn? You should be, in essence, a different version of yourself when the memoir is done.
So, it'll change you whether you like it or not.
Yeah, it's true.
But you will. I just see it as, I do a lot of work, as many of you know, with writing as healing, writing as transformation, and you don't have to set out to write a transformational memoir. But writing anything, writing a novel, writing a poem, certainly writing a memoir about your life, it's going to change you, and it's the exchange that we make to be creative. So take the leap.
Yeah, that's true. It's good advice. And this question had come in from Beth by email before the webinar. It seems like the bigger the memoir sells, the greater amount of dysfunctional family history in that person's story. Liars Club, Wild, etc. Is that true, and why? And where does it leave memoirs of people who haven't experienced horrendous childhoods?
Yeah. Well, why don't you address that, because you were a publisher for a while. I agree that it seems like it's what you call a trauma Olympics.
Yeah.
Why don't you comment on that, would you?
Well, I think it's an interesting thing, because book publishers, when they're acquiring books, are looking for things that they think are saleable. And I think for a long time, this kind of dysfunctional coming-of-age story was the thing that was saleable. I think to some extent, it's run its course. Now there are all kinds of other memoirs. But people have complicated stories, and obviously complicated and dysfunctional stories make for good memoir. So I don't know. I have written about what I call the trauma Olympics sometimes, because I do think some people come to the table with this unfortunate sort of misunderstanding that, oh, well, I had a dysfunctional childhood and mine was even more messed up than Mary Karr's or Jeanette Walls's or whoever's, and so I'm just going to be like, well, I was a childhood prostitute and I was you know, a raging alcoholic, and I was abused, and I was this, and I was that. And I've seen these kinds of memoirs sometimes, and you're just like, whoa, 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 whoa. Like, there's a bit kind of like too much, too fast, too loud, and that's not really what these memoirists are doing. I mean, there's a lot, and Mary Karr is kind of in your face a couple of different times, but there's also more to the story than just abuse, or more to the story than just a messed up mom and dad. So I think you need to be careful with the balance that we've talked about. And that said, you know, the reasons why publishers acquire the books that they acquire are very, very complex, more than we can get into tonight. So, but I agree with you. I mean, it does seem to be true, and it could also just be the fact that those people have powerful stories to tell and people want to read about them.
But there are many, many other kinds of memoirs, and this is something that we teach in all of our courses, are the different kinds of memoirs that are out there. And there's spiritual memoirs, there's inner exploration memoirs, there are quiet memoirs, there are very internal journey memoirs, and they're being published too.
So, relationship memoirs, you know, any level of thing that you can possibly think about, and some of them are more subtle, and that is perfectly fine. I think that's the thing that's important to leave from that, is that you don't want to just like be scraping the bottom of the barrel of your experiences trying to come up with the most dramatic and traumatic stuff you can if that's not really at the heart of your story.
Yeah.
So
it isn't totally necessary to have all that to be published, in other words.
Exactly. Absolutely not. So people, let's see, I'm just looking for these questions. Dawn is asking, does Mary Karr go back and forth between present and past tense? And she does a bit.
Oh, yeah, a lot. She goes between I and you also. And she does this in Cherry, her second book, as well. Very interesting to note what she is doing in tenses and in time and in point of view.
Yeah, and those are things that can really help you all with your own writing to become better writers. That what I was talking about earlier with regard to being fluid, this is so much of our longer courses are about teaching the craft of memoir. And the thing about learning the craft is learning to be an expert, getting better at what you're doing. It's a practice. We teach this in our longer courses, that it is a discipline, and I am always using sports metaphors like running because I run, or yoga, having a yoga practice, that you don't just show up to the first day of yoga completely bendy and flexible, right? But over a year of practice, you get a lot better, and then you can say, yes, my body has changed. And that is the same thing that happens as you write memoir. And if you practice and you're coming to your writing 2, 3, 4 times a week, you're going to change. Your body is going to change, your skill set is going to change, and you're going to have more accessibility to all of these different techniques that these writers are writing. You know, maybe they're doing it seamlessly or not. You know, perhaps their own background and learning is quite intensive. So it's just learning to write better by understanding what techniques they're using. Okay, so this is a question, it's a great question, Adrienne, which goes much beyond just this class in Mary Karr, but where should people try to publish stories about life until the full-length book is ready to submit for publication?
So many places, golly. You know, you have to go out there and Google these places. One place that shows you good places that are looking for publications is the classified ads in Poets and Writers. And you can see it listed. You don't have to get the magazine. You can see it listed on poetsandwriters.com. Well, I don't think that's the URL address, but you can Google it and get to their website. And people are actively looking for pieces there. There is also a listserv. Oh, geez, let me see if I can. Do you know the address?
Oh, the crops listserv.
Yeah.
We can mail that out when we send out the. I can't spell it.
Yeah, to send out this. It's a list that you can sign up for, and every day. Here, I have it. It's CRWROPPS. Never mind. We'll send out the link. But they have requests for literary journals in every day. other things too, like job listings. But they have requests for poetry, or it's contests or listings of what people are looking for out there. I'm working on a list, and maybe Brooke and I can work on a list together of places. I'm starting to do research on hearing about it. We'll put it on NAMW under resources when we get it together, but it's not finished right now, and the lists keep changing.
Yeah, that's great. And you know, there are resources everywhere, so definitely check out our sites. But it is a great idea to do that, to try to get your work submitting, just get in the habit of submitting your work. All right, where are we on time? Okay, so we can take this question. Betty says, resolution of my story. The memoir I'm working on covers 5 years of domestic abuse in my first marriage. Some of my readers feel it's important to talk about where I am now. Married to husband number 2 for 30 plus years, but that's not my instinct. What do you think? Well, I think you have to pay attention to your instincts, certainly. And it's interesting to think about what readers want to know, and if part of your transformation or your growth was that your second marriage was healthier, that you married someone good for you, or you know, a better person after that experience of domestic abuse, then it's possible that that's what they're looking for, that's part of the resolution that they're looking for. And so you can do an epilogue, and I am a big fan of epilogues. Actually, I think that they can help a lot. They don't have to be very long. They could be 3, 4, 10 pages in which you say, you know, here's this dramatic experience that I had, but you need to be careful if your tendency or the feedback that you're getting from people is, okay, well, this is all just a bunch of you needing to process your stuff, you know, like what happened to you. And that, remember that the transformation and how you get through and where you end up is equally important.
Absolutely, the arc of the book, the where do you end up. And it doesn't have to be also, some people say, well, I was working with someone who said, well, I don't want to finish this, I have to finish this book on proving that I got a good relationship. And then she kept losing the relationships, and then she didn't think she could write the book. I said, you know, actually, there's a lot of people who want to know you're okay, even though you're not in a relationship.
Yeah.
You know, and there's different messages. I mean, you have to write the truth and all that. But in any case, if someone's in a good relationship, that is a good thing for the reader to know. And you can come around as the now narrator and let the reader know that way. They want to know you're okay.
Yeah, that's the thing. People do want to know that you're okay in the end. They don't want to be so worried about you or feel like they're caretaking you or taking care of your emotions somehow. And so that's something people do like I don't want to say Hollywood ending, but people do like some sort of going out on a positive note ending. So you can have a traumatic ending, but it's not common. I'm trying to think if I've seen it. I'm sure I have somewhere. But you could, you know, you see that in the movies. It's the same kind of thing. The books that are in, or the endings that are in movies tend to be more more upbeat. So, all right.
Well, we all want a good ending, but
yeah, a resolved ending. Let's put it that way. Not necessarily all tied up.
Right.
So.
Right.
Well, thank you all. Your questions have been great. We appreciate it so much, and we appreciate you coming and spending your hour with us. We hope that some of you will join us for the longer 4-week course, and we'll be looking for your insights into what you want us to teach next, because we'll be doing another one of these in the fall.
Yes, and thank you all so much for being with us, and be sure and get in touch with us. And if you're not on my newsletter at the National Association of Memoir Writers, you can go there by going to www.namw.org and signing up to find out what else is going on.
Yeah, and find us both online on Facebook and Twitter. So we have lots of publishing and writing stuff going on, and we'll see you out there.
Yeah,
Thanks, everybody. Good night, Linda Joy.
Good night. Bye-bye.